All right, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Hass. I'm a second and third grade teacher in Richland School District 2 and also the Midlands area rep for SC for Ed. And as an organization, we are nonpartisan. We do not endorse candidates. We do not endorse parties. But what we do want to do is make sure that when people come to the polls, they have an idea of where each candidate stands in terms of issues related to public education. So this session is on South Carolina House District 117. There are three people on the ticket. On the Democrat side, we have incumbent Krystle Matthews. On the Republican primary, we have two candidates, Bill Crosby and Jordan Pace. So we do reach out to each and every candidate in each of these races and invite them to this forum to have an opportunity to reach out to voters and let them know where they stand and what they believe about public education. And for this particular race, Jordan Pace has agreed to come in and talk to you all and share a little bit about his beliefs on that topic. So I'm going to start by welcoming you. Thanking you so much for spending your time with us, and maybe just introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your platform as a candidate.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate you guys making this kind of stuff available to folks, especially in these days. It's been challenging, I guess, is the best way to say it, to reach out to folks. I was expecting to burn through a few pairs of shoes, knocking doors. And that's
Right.
definitely not happening. Now it's just I'm wearing out earbuds, I guess, instead, making phone calls and doing stuff like this. So thanks for doing this. Like, my name's Jordan Pace. I'm actually a high school teacher. I teach at Northwood Academy in Somerville, Goose Creek area of the Low Country. This is my second year teaching, and I was a substitute before that. Actually been teaching first through fifth grade at my church for almost 10 years. So it's been an interesting transition from kind of once a week to every day for the last couple of years. But it's been good. It's been fun. I spent my whole academic career, K through 12th grade in, government public schools in the upstate. So also seeing a little bit of a different atmosphere going from that to a private school, even though it's a very affordable, like one of the most affordable private schools, especially in the Low Country, and very, very diverse. It's definitely different, the whole mentality there versus where I grew up. But yeah, I got announced I was going to run for this seat in, I think it was September of last fall. It's been a Republican seat since 1976. And I still think it's a Republican seat. Flukes happen every once in a while. Just think the populace of the district probably aligns with what I believe on most of the issues rather than the incumbent. Nothing against her personally. I just think, it's very much a policy-based campaign is what I'm trying to go for.
Yeah. So in regards to education, what is your opinion on the state of public education in South Carolina today?
It's not good. That's not probably a remarkable or a groundbreaking statement. We've known it's not good for quite a while. Unfortunately, the legislature has seemed incapable or unwilling to do anything serious about it. And we could jump down 1,000 different rabbit holes on why that is, but everybody knows that it's not good. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, the measuring stick was graduation rates. Particularly when I was in high school, that was what got beat into our heads. Is like, graduation rates are terrible. We got to do something about this. And in typical government fashion, rather than make the problem better, they made it go away by making it much, much easier to pass high school. And so now we have a really good graduation rate, but our effective literacy rate is about somewhere between second and third grade for high school graduates. I read a study a few weeks ago. It was pretty in depth. I want to say it was Princeton. It was one of those Ivy League schools, looking at effective literacy rates in the South from the 1880s versus today. And according to that study, there was a higher effective literacy rate in the 1880s across all races and ethnicities and socioeconomic classes than today, which is just I don't know to laugh or cry or both. Something's broken is what that tells me. Yeah, and I look, a lot of folks think it's a spending problem. And when I look at Charleston County, which is almost $20,000 a student, this is a tremendous amount of money. I think Charleston County's school board's budget is capped $500 million a year for the last 3 or 4 years. It's definitely not a spending problem. There's certainly some counties and some school districts across the state, particularly in the PD 95 corridor, that don't have the money to do what they need to do. But across the board, the problems, much like most problems we look at, just can't be fixed by throwing money at it, by throwing technology at it. If you look at Berkeley County, test results wise, Cross High School does not do well. But Cross High School has 3 devices, whether they be tablets or Chromebooks, per student in that high school, given to them, whether it's from Google or from the state, whoever. So it's not a money problem. It's not a technology problem. What we've lacked, I think, in the legislature is an educator's perspective. I think at any given time there was maybe 1 or 2 retired educators that had served in the State House. If I'm privileged enough to win in June and then November, I'm still going to teach. Worked it out with the so I'll teach some advanced classes in the mornings before we go to the State House when we're in session. So I'll be up real early, a couple of days a week with some real go-getters to do some advanced stuff with them before heading to the State House. So I intend to keep teaching and serving the State House at the same time. If I'm
So should you wind up at the State House, this is a question of priorities. What would be one of the first steps you'd want to try to take to improve public education?
So I've talked to especially a lot of local teachers and school board officials. In general, my philosophy on government is local is better. So local communities know themselves better than a bureaucrat in Columbia. So it's broadly, I would like to see a lot of the regulation and control, whether it be over testing, over too much grasp on control of materials, whatever it may be from Columbia, that's pushed down on the school districts. Relax that, let school districts explore and figure out what works. I mean, the whole model of federalism that the founders started this country as, where the states were supposed to be laboratories of democracy and figure out what works and what doesn't work well, and then share that and implement it, rather than a force one size fits all from the top down on everybody, and if it doesn't work, we all suffer. I think that same model will work with school districts. If we take away all the burdensome regulation and such. I mean, like I said, I teach at a private school. Private school teachers don't get paid more than public school teachers. That's probably not a secret. So when I got there, I asked a lot of them, because the overwhelming majority of them came from public schools. So why did you decide to come here? Some of them said, it was more convenient. Their kids went there. Most of them, though, I mean, like 75% or more said it wasn't because they weren't getting paid enough. They said, yeah, it'd be great to get paid more. It was because of the regulatory nightmare that teaching had become, whether it was the testing or all the extra stuff. They said, most of them say, I got into teaching because I want to teach. And they weren't being allowed to do that in whatever school they came from. So that was the theme that I've gotten from them, and even from school board members, particularly in Berkeley County. We've seen a rapid improvement fiscally in Berkeley County on how they've handled the money in dealing with just an explosion of growth. And it kind of features on, even if you have a really, really good committed school board, if your population is growing exponentially like we are in Berkeley County, you can't build schools fast enough, like physical buildings fast enough. And even if you could, the way demographics work, 10, 15 years from now, we're going to have a whole lot more school buildings than we need. If the pattern stays the same we've seen for the last 100 years, we have ebbs and flows in population. So government's not known for being very dynamic or able to adapt very quickly to problematic situations. I think we've seen that firsthand in the last 2 months. Government was not prepared for this, whether it be the education side of things or the legislature in general. But in response to that, we've seen teachers, I've had teacher friends of mine in both private and public schools, relate to me creative ways that they've figured out how to teach their students. I'm dealing with a lot more middle school and high school teachers than elementary, so you could probably tell me a little bit more about what y'all are doing at that level. But as far as interacting with their students, whether it be through Google Hangouts like we're doing now, through online assignments, all kinds of stuff, it's really been teachers working their butts off to make it work, which is put on full display for the last 2 months. So teachers aren't the problem. It's they want to teach. They would like, and getting paid adequate salary is good and something we should look at. But overall, I think it's more of the burdensome other stuff rather than actual teaching, whether it be testing or having their hands tied disciplinary wise, not being backed up by their administrators. Yeah.
So I want to go back to you brought up funding a little bit earlier. So as I'm sure you're aware, in South Carolina, we shifted from funding public education from property taxes to sales taxes. And then when 2008 came around, there was a huge hit there. So the funding formula for public education in South Carolina is established by the General Assembly. So that formula is there. So based on their own formula, they have not fully funded us, I think, for the last 11 or 12 years now. And you hear a lot of teachers talking about growing class sizes. You talk about the need for medical health professionals in our schools who can help with students who definitely need that sort of support. We hear stories about, because of pay, our state's losing a little over 6,000 classroom teachers a year, but our state universities are only graduating about 1,600, which is making it harder and harder to get the number of teachers into the buildings that we need so that we can address class size, so we can have the very best educators in our field. School boards and superintendents talk about a lot of the mandates, a lot of the legislation that comes from Columbia doesn't come with the funding to support that. And then that burden is put on districts. So when you think about funding, what does need to happen, do you think, to make this more successful?
Yeah, and so the situation like you're describing, education is not alone in this situation. If you look at, I don't know if you're familiar with this, the local government fund, when they passed Act 388, it wasn't just school boards that were affected, it was also local governments, county councils and such. The state said, you must do these things. And at the time they said, we'll give you X amount of money a year to do it because this, these mandates. Same thing with the schools. But what we've seen for the last nearly 10 years in the local government fund is, rather than pay what they're supposed to, they shortchange it every year by proviso. So in the state budget, just a one-off thing, they'll say, we're going to cut it back this much. So I know Berkeley County in total has been shorted close to $20 million in the last 5 years, maybe more than that. That's just what I know from a year ago numbers. So there's a running theme within the legislature of, hey, counties, school boards, you need to do this. We're not going to give you the money to do this, but you need to do it. So broadly, I think that's an issue. Why that's a problem? Structurally, the state constitution was written in 1895, and it's like 300 pages long. It's a mess. I mean, it is in dire need of reform. And I think what we see, whether it's the local government fund or what you were describing with the education funding, those are really symptoms of a bigger issue, symptoms that need to be addressed, but really symptoms of a deeper sickness that needs to be fixed. And that can't be fixed quickly. It won't be fixed quickly. What it's going to take is electing people that are dedicated to actually fixing it, rather than going along to get along, whether it be Republicans or Democrats. I worked in Columbia for a session, doing a little bit of policy work. And what I noticed is it's really hard to tell once the session's over, Republican from Democrat. They all get together after hours, hang out with each other, and really don't disagree all that much in private, more so in public. There's a lot of theater that goes along. Yeah, and part of me thinks that's somewhat because 90% of them never see a challenger. If you look at the list of who's running this year, it's going to be like most every year, especially in the House. There's not a lot of challengers. And I can run on tangent for that forever. But back to the education funding side. So Act 388, I think, had good intentions. But like a lot of things with the government, good intentions go awry. I don't like property taxes, just the whole theme of them. I also have a real estate license, so I'm looking at this kind of from two sides. If you either own your property or you don't, essentially, even if you paid your property off, you have to keep paying property taxes, or they come and take your property. So do you really own the property? I mean, just on a theoretical level, that's bothersome. Could there be a better way to fund it? Probably. Is Act 388 the way to do it? Probably not. So how do we go about actually funding things correctly? So with Act 388 in place, if somebody walked up there and said, let's repeal Act 388, how is that going to be twisted by anybody who opposes it? Or you're trying to double taxes on property owners? Well, yeah, because that's exactly what it would do, with double taxes on property owners. So the more I've thought about this, I don't know if you're familiar with the Laffer curve. Laffer was an economist back in the 70s, and he ran these formulas and looked at it. It's a line graph. As the government decreased income taxes, from the 1970s through the 80s, through the Reagan era, as federal income taxes dropped, the federal government income actually grew at an exponential level as those income taxes percentages dropped. So the government was actually collecting more money with lower taxes. So in South Carolina, we have the highest income tax in the South. We have one of the higher property taxes in the South, really in the country. We're right there. I think we're 30, 31 or 32 in property taxes as an average. But the reality of it is, homeowners pay 4%. If you rent somewhere, unless you're in like government housing, then we're subsidized. If you just rent on your own, you're paying 6% rather than 4% property taxes built into your rent. Industrial property is taxed at even higher amounts, somewhere between 8 and 12%, depends on what it is. So it is not an equal weights and measures idea. I mean, everybody's taxed differently, depends on what it is. And where that really hits people hardest is the renters. It's the people just above the line where they can get some help with housing. They get hit the hardest because they're paying more in property taxes than even homeowners who are in a $150,000 house versus somebody who's renting a townhouse, which is kind of a hard step to explain to people. And I do that kind of on the real estate side. As far as how do we get to equitable funding, you get what you pay for. So really, when we have it set up this way, inevitably we're going to have less funding for places with lower property values. So if it's all based on property tax, places in Kershaw County and Calhoun County, that I-95 corridor, Allendale, places like that with much lower property values than Greenville and Columbia and Charleston, are inevitably going to have less money to do what they need to do. Which is kind of comes full circle back to Charleston County spending $20,000 a kid per year versus Allendale, which I think is somewhere around 9 or 12 at most. I think Allendale was actually the lowest at like 10, 9.5, 10. Most of that coming from the state, which, like you said, is coming from the sales tax. In reality, there's no good answer to this. Either what we're doing, I think, is playing in the middle of the road. We're saying, let's do some property tax, some income tax, some sales tax, throw it all in one pot, and who gets to decide where that money is distributed? About 5 or 6 powerful legislators on the House Ways and Means Committee and on the Senate Finance Committee. And that's how it works.
Yeah.
rather than saying, all right, well, us in Berkeley County, we're going to do away with the property tax entirely. Do away with the property tax for school board, and we'll have a 2% sales tax, or I don't know, something. Or even, now this is going to sound, I'm not saying I'm going to introduce legislation to do this next month, but it's something we should look at. Expanded charter and private schools. Like there's a charter school, or it's actually a private school, not a charter school, in Charleston County that's getting started. It's part of a network. It's called Krystle Ray. It's a parochial network. Started in Chicago, and its whole mission, I think there's 30 something of these schools now all over the country. Its mission is to go into minority majority communities and give students a bilingual education, Spanish and English, geared toward preparing them to be in the workplace. And they do this, again, it's a private school, so they raise money through donations, and rather than paying tuition, they work with local businesses, so that 1 or 2 days a week, starting in 9th grade, the student will go to some sort of white collar business and do office work, secretarial stuff. I don't know, there's a whole list of things. Sometimes they're at colleges, universities. Sometimes they're at, I think, Benefit Focus. I think it's locally here, is one of the first companies to jump on board. So do stuff in these fairly large employers to get their foot in the door for a working environment. But that employer pays them, and that money goes toward their tuition. So with the combination of fundraising on the school's end, and then from these businesses, these students not only get an education and working in high school 1 day a week, it pays their tuition. So they get a high class education. It's parochial, so they have a little bit of biblical values there, but it's not, it's taken the wrong way. It's not evangelical. They're not Bible thumping every day as part of their lesson plans. It's really an incredible institution, and they have like a 98% college placement rate. They work with colleges all over the country who know kind of the background of these kids to find them scholarships. It's really awesome. I think it's a wonderful model. I don't know when exactly they're starting in Charleston, but it's going to be soon, the next couple of years, assuming they find the funding they're looking for. I think we need to look at models like that. What I've seen for the last 50 years is government schools trying to be fixed by the government that don't work. We have teachers who want to teach, school boards who want to educate locally, and elected and held accountable locally. But everything the legislature, what little they've done, has not been effective. So I think it's time to start looking outside of the government to fix these problems, and look toward our communities. Maybe it might be these low to no cost private schools. If you look around the world, Sweden has had a pretty good run at, I'm not going to use the V word, backpacking funding. So parents can send their kids to wherever they want. Sweden's different. It's a different culture than here. I'm not saying that would work exactly the same way. South Korea has had, again, very different culturally, but they have kind of a minimal public schooling infrastructure. And then if you want to go above and beyond that, which a lot of them do, parents sometimes pay for tutors after school, and there's organizations there to help families who can't afford that to find tutors for after school. It's just, I think we need to look at seeing what works in other places, because demonstrably what works in other places well, rather than beating our heads against the wall. What was the Einstein quote? If you do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, that's the definition of insanity. Yeah. That's what we've been doing for 50 years. We've been trying the same thing over and over again. Well, these tests don't work. Let's try a different test.
Speaking of tests, that's our last question on that topic. So in your opinion, what would a successful accountability system for education look like?
Well, if we can manage to get it fully, or at least as fully as possible, in the control of local school boards and even to parents, parents and families are ultimately who decides whether that education is adequate and successful. Again, I'm coming from a biblical worldview, which I know not everybody does, but the biblical worldview says it's the family's responsibility, and specifically it's the father, if you want to get down to the details of it, says the father's responsibility to educate their children. So if we looked at from a grassroots level up, it's the families and then the communities up who are going to tell us whether this education is successful. It's not, what we're doing today is looking at Boeing or Bosch or Michelin and saying, and the state, economic guys saying, hey, what do you need in a worker? And then trying to gear the government education system to fulfill the needs of those companies, which is the Prussian model. I mean, that is the Prussian model from the 1800s that we looked at to start the whole. I mean, that's what this public school system really came from. Brought over from Europe, from Prussia to New York, and kind of spread out from there. I don't think that works. What we've seen work best historically is classical education, whether math, science, arithmetic, reading, language arts, oratory skills, stuff that we were teaching in the early 1900s, late 1800s, prepared people to think. And as we're moving into an information age, we're already there. We're Skyping. That's old. I'm old. We're video conferencing from hundreds of miles away. We're in the information age. We're not in the industrial age anymore. So we don't need industrial age worker bees. We need people who can think. So I think we need to look to the future. We need to look to the past. Let's use classical methods of teaching students how to think and understand and comprehend for themselves. If they want to go and be a plumber, we have desperate needs for trades, plumber, carpentry, all that stuff. We have a technical college system. If you want to see what actually works pretty well that the state does with education, probably the only thing that I can say that they do well is the technical education system. Most of the tech schools around the state do a really good job with not that much funding. So maybe you look at that. And if somebody wants to go work at Boeing and Bosch, that's where they need. I would love for that. I'm glad these companies are here. I'm glad they brought jobs here. But I know most people in South Carolina work in small businesses, and small business owners who I've talked to many, many, many of them over the last couple of years. They want people who can think, that are adaptable, that have soft skills to be able to deal with people. If you want to learn how to fix machinery or do something very specific like that, that company can pay for you to do that. You can go to a tech school after you graduate from high school to learn how to do that. That's where I'd like to see us go in the future. Because once somebody figures out how to think and comprehend for themselves, take in information, and rather than just regurgitate it, actually chew it up and figure out what that means and do something with it, you can teach that person to do anything. So how do we hold that accountable? It can't be with tests. We're even seeing the SATs, colleges moving away from SATs and ACTs. So we're starting to figure out standardized testing doesn't work like, it's not a panacea. It's not a magic bullet. Can it be helpful? Sure. I think the SATs are helpful for colleges trying to figure out who's acceptable and who's not for whatever their range is. But as far as assessing education in South Carolina, being able to regurgitate a bunch of facts is not a good assessment. Parity. I don't think there is one that we can say other than reading level at a certain degree. But I say that's somewhat dangerous because, hey, if the state's the one determining what's the reading levels, like they did the graduation rates, they could just say, we're going to read on a third grade reading level. We better bump that up. Sea Dog Run is now fifth grade. So that can be manipulated. Any of these measurements can be manipulated in a way that makes bureaucrats look better. And they have a record of doing that. So that's why I'm hesitant to give an answer on some sort of this is the standard, other than do we have a generation, do we have people coming out of our education system, whether it be public, private, homeschool, parochial, whatever, what groups of these people are coming out with the ability to think and comprehend best? If two or three, if we look at whether it's public and parochial or homeschool and charter, I don't know. If we can find a way to measure that, see which one works better, kind of my question would be, if we present that to the public and say, these two groups didn't do better than these three groups, I don't know. Would people look at it and go, all right, let's try doing that more? Maybe. But ultimately, it's up to the parents, the families, the communities to make those assessments, and not bureaucrats in Columbia, and certainly not legislators. What I want to hear as a legislator, potential legislator, is to, if we can go back in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, and talk to parents of high schoolers and say, what have you seen different for these years to make your kid be able to understand this stuff better? I don't know. It can't be done. Here's what I'm trying to say is, it can't be done in a centralized way, because we tried it and it doesn't work. We tried it every which way possible, and no centralized standard way has done it. Which is why I get back. Kind of go back full circle here. I don't think Columbia can fix it. It has to come from the local level up, and in order for those local level up folks to start making changes, meaningful changes in how they do things, the grapple from Columbia has to come off. The standardized testing mandates, all those mandatory mandates you were mentioning, whether it's from the legislature or from the education department, that don't come with the funding. Step one would be eliminate those, which is scary. If you got what's the Kipling analogy? If you get the tiger by the ears, it's very scary to let go. Or the wolf by the tail. There's a lot of these animal analogies, but you can't stand there forever. I'm a big believer in freedom. I'm a big believer in people, and that people and families, communities have a lot of wisdom to take care of themselves if given the opportunity to do it. So I would be in favor of, rather than increasing funding to go with the mandates, let's lift the mandates, get rid of the mandates, let the school districts locally, communities locally, families better make decisions for themselves. If that means, so one thing that I think has been fairly successful is the, I'm trying to remember what it's called, the special needs scholarship. There's a name for it. It's not very, it's a system that through the treasurer's office, there's a board that runs it, where individuals can donate money. It's tax deductible to the scholarship fund, and it goes toward children with special needs to get into private schools that specialize in special needs education. Maybe if their local school district just not big enough, if they're in Allendale or Kershaw, places like that, where they're just not a big enough demand to have a really robust special needs program, it allows them to send their children to a private school that might have that. And it's been pretty successful. So maybe we look at that. Maybe, rather than send chunks and chunks of tax money to I-95, we expand that program to make it easier. So, if you live in these school districts, you're able to have access to a program like that, and make it easier for private schools to start up. When I say private school, I'm afraid people are going to think Porter-Gaud or Hammond or something. Most private schools in South Carolina are not big, giant, expensive Bishop Englands or something like that. Most of them are really trying to be as affordable as possible. Many of them, especially look at SCISA, South Carolina Independent School District, many of them are fairly new, like started in the last 20 years, with a really niche component, whether it be special needs or arts or something like that, kind of like a lot of the charter schools. So I would, if there is a panacea, magic bullet, something like that, the closest thing to it would be, let's see a little bit more diversity in how we educate, and making that easier for whether it be private schools, charter schools, homeschooling collectives, I don't know. All the above. Make it easier in South Carolina for those to start. Because I think it'll help not only students, but teachers. If a teacher, like in a lot of teachers in my school, they made a choice to get paid less money to have more freedom in how they teach, and just a different environment. People can make that decision. And if we had more diversity in education options through relaxation of those regulations, I think students, families, and teachers, everybody across the board, would be happier and probably better educated. At minimum, I know we haven't tried that yet on a large scale, and we've tried just about everything else. We've tried more money, we've tried more testing, we've tried more control, like more state control has been the answer for the last 50 years. It's just less control of the district, less control of the community, more of the state. And we've seen a deterioration incrementally in that same 50 years. So I'm saying maybe let's try the other direction. And I'm trying to.
So we have about, I'm sorry, so we have maybe a minute or two left. Is there any last words you'd like to say just to speak directly out to any potential voters?
Yeah. Again, I don't have 20 years in education, but I have some experience in education. I have some experience as a small business owner, as a manager, pretty diverse background in employment. I've spent time in private schools and government schools in different parts of the state. So I think I have a pretty good, maybe not assessment, but at least a decent understanding of what's been tried, what hasn't worked, and what hasn't been tried. So my encouragement would be at least consider, when people start naming charter schools, saying charter schools or private schools or parochial schools, whatever, those kind of words, that a lot of us have been conditioned to go, that's anti-education, that's anti-teacher. Rather than jump on buzzwords, stop and think about it, and think about the fact that those haven't been tried. And if we're really going to consider ourselves, especially those of us who are educators, to be educated, the mark of an educated person is to be able to think about different options without being threatened by them, to be open-minded without two different ideas, until at least they've been proven to be, that they won't work either. At least give it a shot. So that would be my encouragement to folks. Be a little bit open-minded to different things, because we know it hasn't worked, but yeah, that would be my encouragement.
Well, thank you very much for spending time answering all of our questions.
Thanks
and
for having
talking
me.
to education in South Carolina. I just want to remind everyone, primaries are on June 9th. And just as Jordan mentioned, a lot of people run unopposed. And a lot of people don't understand that probably the most important elections that take place in our state are the primaries that happen in June, because that's when people do have some opposition and you do have an opportunity to make a little bit of a choice in terms of who's going to represent you in Columbia. So everyone, make sure you get out and vote. And thanks again, Jordan, for spending time with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.